Thank you very much. After you've heard me grind on in a voiceover, the only thing to talk about to you is my cat. Thank you for the opportunity to be with you. And I want to start at a point, not in terms of what you've seen in that little clip, but in terms of the observations that we must make right now about our country and the world. A sense of things coming apart very badly. If you turn on your televisions, onto the international channels particularly, I'm not advertising public broadcaster, you will see the tragedy of rivers of people arriving in Europe right now. Many of them are leaving Syria, where about 250,000 people have died over the past 2 or so years. 250,000 people have died on our watch. And if you look at the numbers of people moving around the world, it's a deep tragedy that's happening in our lifetimes. It's the biggest movement of people since World War II. You look at the numbers of people, I mean, there must be about 7 million Syrians in Syria who are displaced, who led decent middle-class lives, who lived in houses and had jobs, and who now no longer have those jobs. And we see these numbers spill over to the rest of the world. 2 million in Turkey, 1.25 million in Lebanon. In fact, 1 in 5 people now in Lebanon is Syrian. And you see these increasing numbers of people arriving on the shores of Europe, joined by people displaced from elsewhere, Iraq, Iran, Bangladesh, Pakistan, and then, tragically, a number of Africans. And we see, I mean, last week the tragedy was communicated very strongly in that picture published on the front page of newspapers around the world of that young boy. And then the story of his mother who lost her life, his sister who lost her life, and his father there alone, and even the aunt living in Canada who financed their trip out of Syria. She feels a sense of guilt about what happened. It's a deep tragedy happening while we sit here this evening. And as we see the response of Europe, and perhaps the most remarkable response has been from the German Chancellor Angela Merkel, who's opened her arms and said, Germany has lived through a deep tragedy before. We have a different kind of responsibility now. And as we've seen that, we've also seen some of the worst statements by leaders. Viktor Orban in Hungary, Tony Abbott in Australia, Bibi Netanyahu in Israel, have shown the worst of humanity right now when there's the inability to empathize with the position of people. Now, I start far away because I think we need to bring some of these stories home as well. The other big tragedy of our times is, of course, that the unemployment numbers are huge. According to the International Labour Organization, there were about 210 million people unemployed last year, the bulk of them young. And by 2019, the world will have to create another 280 million jobs to absorb people who leave school and who will start families and so on. And of course, one of the worst affected parts of the world in unemployment is right here around us in Southern Africa, and South Africa in particular. So the stories we tell in the way in which we diagnose the problem for the National Development Plan lives on. Unemployment numbers have actually grown, and the sense of almost despair for too many school leavers is too real. But it's not just the sense of not having access to income, it's all of the other social problems we encounter around us. Because young people who have the energy and a sense that they need to do something and find that society has just ejected them, then find recourse in a series of social problems. I still do a lot of work in Mitchell's Plain when I'm in Cape Town, and I see how families fall apart because some or other child has become a drug addict. I see this not confined to the addict or the family, but to the street, to the neighborhood, to the community. And these are issues that I think we are called upon to respond to, understand in order to respond to in ways that make sense and provide opportunities to people who otherwise feel ejected by society. I think that this is, in many ways, the challenge of the moment. Whatever else we do in respect of the National Development Plan, if we can't fix our education system and ensure that more and more people leave school with the kinds of skills that allow them to be absorbed into the economy, if we can't create employment in this economy, then I think our democracy will be brought into very serious jeopardy. That's the reality that confronts us now and for many people. There's a sense of things falling apart. When the family falls apart and the street falls apart and the community falls apart, then there's a sense that things have fallen apart. Of course, to literature there are two big pieces. The one is something that hopefully many of us did as a set work book. Chinua Achebe's Things Fall Apart. And it's a story of an individual in a community and why Nkonkwo's life falls apart. We can spend the evening discussing what we didn't understand when we wrote our set work exam in what was grade 10 then. And the other, perhaps more pertinent, and I want to use this advisedly because I said to Michael, I will stay away from all things theological and leave it to him this evening, is that great poem by William Butler Yeats, and I want to read the first stanza of it because it's so important. It's called The Second Coming. And he writes, turning and turning in the widening eye, the falcon cannot hear the falconer. Things fall apart, the center cannot hold. Mere anarchy is loosed upon the world. A blood-dimmed tide is loosed, and everywhere the ceremony of innocence is drowned. The best lack all conviction, while the worst are full of passionate intensity. So the question is where we are. Do we observe what's happening around us and lack all conviction? Or do we actually just not mind that the worst are driving the responses of people? It's not a uniquely South African issue. It's not a uniquely South African issue because as we observe these trends around the world, they impact. The question is, when we know, what do we do about it? Are we change agents? And how do we respond to issues that we see and know to be wrong? And when we look at the issues that take place in this country, I think we need to remind ourselves that the sense of despair, the sense of things not going according to plan, happens in spite of the fact that we have crafted for ourselves in this generation perhaps the finest constitution ever. A Supreme Court judge in the United States was asked at a conference recently about the U.S. Constitution. I mean, it's much hailed, we the people. And she said, yes, The Constitution of the United States had its place in time. But if you want to understand the Constitution now, then what's important is to look at the South African Constitution. Because it's a bridge between where we've been and where we are. It starts in the preamble by reminding us that we recall the injustices of the past. It calls on us to respect those who've built and contributed to our country. And then it says we adopt this Constitution, 3 words, 6 letters together, so as to. We adopt the Constitution so as to do a number of things, and one of the things that we have to do is to build an open society founded on the rule of law, where all are equal before the law. It commits us, and these are not once-off commitments. I mean, you can build a house once, but there are a different set of requirements of our Constitution because it commits us to raise the living standards of all our citizens and to free the potential of each person. Now, I needn't spend a lot of time explaining to you that living standards get raised on a continuous basis and you must be able to measure it. But similarly, if you haven't had access to the most basic education, you don't even know what your potential is, so how will it be freed? So there are a set of responsibilities that impact on all of us, a community like yourselves who are conscious of this, who have benefited from society like I have, who have to respond to the question, what does this mean for us? How do we then contribute to raising living standards and freeing the potential of people? How do we respond to the fact that some parts of that Constitution are now observed in the exception rather than the rule? This year there have been big conferences in the United Kingdom where the 800th anniversary of the Magna Carta was celebrated. The Magna Carta says, it speaks about equality before the law. We were raised on a diet of understanding all shall be equal before the law. And when we see what's happening around us, how do we as a people respond? And this is where the normal kind of response, where we call Cape Talk, whinge a little bit and put down the phone, and then we feel good about our whinge. We kind of announce, we wait for the elections to come, is an inadequate kind of approach. There's a political scientist called Francis Fukuyama who, in a book called The Origin of Political Order, talks about a successful liberal democracy comprising a strong state and a strong civil society. You've got to have something that exists as a countervailing power between elections. It's a bit like Newton's third law of motion. Now, there must be somebody who was better at science than what I was. I think it's the third law of motion. Do you know this, Mr. Kirsten? But it's that sense of equal and opposite actions. And I think Fukuyama's right about this. If you want a successful democracy, it's not just about waiting and then holding out. It's about how society is organized to ask the questions and ensure that you have responses that make sense, that you have the ability to participate. And it's necessary to do that because, you see, in many ways we have warp. There's a dirty word we don't talk about. Now, I'm not standing up there. I can use dirty words down here. There's a dirty word we don't talk about. It's called power. We never pause and reflect on what power means. Because frequently it's a there's one sense of it which is very negative. It's top-down. It's thou shalt. It's strong states and people who fear. But there's a different side to power that we need to understand, and that is that power is actually what organizes us. It's the power of the voice that brings people coming to church. It's the power of organized societies, organized families. It's a power that operates to get people to behave in particular kinds of ways, to observe certain norms and mores in society. It's power. It doesn't have to be a negative force, but we need to understand it. The more we avoid it, the more difficult it is. And so we have this failure to understand what is important. There's a writer called Moises Naim who, like me, was once a planning minister, and there's a very small, discrete group of people who were planning ministers of our generation. He makes a point about political power. He says, to put it simply, power no longer buys as much as it did in the past. In the 21st century, power is easier to get, harder to use, and easier to lose. From boardrooms and combat zones to cyberspace, battles for power are as intense as ever, but they are yielding diminishing returns. Their fierceness masks the increasingly evanescent nature of power itself. Understanding our power is losing its value and facing up to the hard challenges this poses is the key to making sense of the most important trends in reshaping the world in the 21st century. Don't have to believe me, or Moises Naim is a former planning minister. But if I said Julian Assange, what do you say? WikiLeaks. And if I say Edward Snowden, what do you say? NSA. And if I say Bill Gates, you begin to ask who took on the World Health Organization. And right now there's this big fanfare in the United States because next year they have to elect a new president. But if you look at the United States right now, regardless of what President Obama wants to do about climate change, Congress says we have a different view of these things. But if you go to sleep tonight and you lie on your pillow and you think about who the most powerful person is in the world right now, you might say it's the President of the United States. But the power isn't there because a lot of the political power, ask me, I sat in a cabinet room for 20 years, is a bit of a mirage. Something you aspire to, and then you get there and it gets further and further away from you. Well, I had a different kind of privilege. I could kind of impose taxes. That's real power. But for the bulk of politics, it's pretty much a mirage. The key issue is how do you use power and how do you respond to when power is being abused? Because it's not only in politics. You see, when some gentleman in Soshanguve gets people to eat snakes, I think it's an abuse of the power of the word. Everybody else says, well, maybe it's like that. We've just never experienced it. Maybe we're too soft on ourselves. We don't eat hair and snakes and stuff, and we don't jump. Who's the pastor here? Do you jump on people? You see, because this notion of power can be abused if everybody else remains silent. And part of what we're living through right now is our inability to understand that the organization of power and the organization of society needs a sense of equilibrium that Fukuyama writes of. Strong civil society with voice that takes forward the interests of people who frequently see themselves as being without voice. And that's the chance that we don't give this democracy so that we think that it's voting once every 5 years. But like everything else, this has changed. Growing up, we all used to wait for the 7 o'clock news. Now we no longer bother. because we'll check our Twitter feed and know exactly what is happening and what will be said in the 7 o'clock news. The world has changed. Our access to information has changed. The kinds of things we know. I mean, can you imagine? 70 years ago, living through World War II, you wouldn't have seen the sea of people arriving. In Europe, you wouldn't have heard about the statements by Viktor Orban in Hungary until maybe 6 months later. Now it's all live. But while all of that is live, we still think that a democracy is about voting once every 5 years and then it's okay. Our side wins, our side loses, it's okay. It's like that. Last year, the Nelson Mandela lecture was delivered by the serving president of Chile. Her name is Michelle Bachelet. And she actually delivered that lecture here in the City Hall in Cape Town on the 9th of August. And she made a very important point about mere standards of legality being insufficient because access to information is very different. But yet we don't ensure that we create opportunities for participation that are different. Nothing illegal about it. There's nothing unconstitutional about it. We just don't use the opportunity because we ourselves have become lazy in our approach to our fellow human beings. And you know, I am suggesting that part of our problem at the moment is, as Yeats writes in that poem, The Second Coming, the falcon doesn't hear the falconer. We don't know what the signals are. We are part of that collective falcon. We are around there somewhere, but we aren't getting the signals about what we should do. And so part of what we need to do is to engage with issues that are out there. I think that we have the most unbelievable constitution. And it wasn't just drafted so that we have a nice constitution. I say those three words, so as to, is the empowerment that our constitution gives us. We've taken that old spirit forward beyond the diagnostic of what the National Planning Commission saw. We've developed a plan about what needs to be done, and the plan is premised very clearly, not just on what the government or the state does. There's a very strong call for active citizenry. If you look at the second installment, there's another little, in fact, there are two other clips. But the second clip deals very strongly with getting society to work differently, getting communities to work differently is something that is premised on active citizenry. If nobody takes responsibility, nobody cares. And I think if all of us just live in a zone where we say, we're okay, we aren't okay, we've got jobs, we have some investments, we have the education, we're okay, so that's it, we're okay. I think we fail ourselves, we fail our belief systems, we fail our democracy. I'm saying that our Constitution sets a frame, it sets a task, and it speaks to rational people with energy to make a difference. And I think that's a challenge of the moment. So when we go home from here and we turn on our televisions and we see this river of people arriving at the Austrian border, going into Germany, if we see that, we don't think about that. We've got to think about ourselves and our responsibilities as well. I hope we can discuss these issues this evening. But having said that, I promised you I would talk about my cat. Now let me. Thank you very much.